The past couple of weeks or so have been brutal for Xbox, PlayStation, and PC owners. We get a new release, and everybody, leading up to release day, spends their time on the internet screaming about how great it's going to be. Black Myth Wukong is Game of the Year. Astrobot is the best game ever made. Tekken 8, every single time they come out. Oh, Power World. Yeah, I completely forgot. Dragon's Dogma 2. New Overwatch character. Every single time a new release comes out, we have this very brief period of relevancy where everybody is pretending this game is some masterpiece and it's some industry-defining thing, that this is the reason to own a PlayStation and why Nintendo is lagging behind, right? This is why we were told Space Marine 2 is the true next-gen experience, right? This is why people hyped up Baldur's Gate 3. This is why, Black Myth Wukong, right? Wukong, because nobody knows who the fuck this is. These games get hyped up and forgotten about just as quickly in order to move on to the next thing. To get people to in a desperate attempt to get people to not notice that the Nintendo games that are coming out are far, far superior. Emio was better. Ace Attorney Investigations was better. Zelda's going to be better. And that's just a month of releases, right? That's not even going to all the wild stuff we got earlier this year with Princess Peach Showtime and Unicorn Overlord, right? This game, this year was amazing for games if you're a Nintendo fan. But again, Square Enix has to try and do what they always do. They tried, and they failed to put out a major PlayStation exclusive. They brought back an old IP that was doing really well on Nintendo hardware, by the way. They brought back a new IP, a new entry in a classic RPG franchise, and tried to make it PlayStation exclusive. The Secret of Mana re-releases on Switch, the Secret of Mana collection, and the remake of the third game, right? Secret of Mana 2, Suikoden Densetsu 2, or whatever it is. These games did phenomenally well on Switch. What does Square Enix do when it's time to produce a sequel? We want to make the game on a real console. Visions of Mana couldn't possibly run on a Nintendo Switch, right? Just like Metaphor ReFantasio can't, right? Just like Trails can't. Just like Yeast 10 can't. Right? Oh man, Nintendo will never get games like Nier Automata, Yakuza Kiwami, or Persona 5 Royal. It just isn't powerful enough. Again, this has been a dying argument for a long time, right? Niche Japanese games obviously can run on a Nintendo console, right? This has always been true, right? There's never been anything wrong with Nintendo hardware. But companies are very desperate to keep the PlayStation train rolling, and the only way they can keep that platform relevant is by throwing everything they have at it, right? So new Final Fantasy games, PlayStation exclusive. Kingdom Hearts, PlayStation exclusive for a long time. The new Mana game, it's a PlayStation exclusive. And traditionally, this would work. Right? Traditionally, people would look at this and they would just go oh, I guess Nintendo just doesn't make good hardware. Completely unaware of what's going on behind the scenes, the evil machinations of those people at Sony, right? How the real talent at these companies have been jumping ship to Nintendo consoles for years, right? You have one of the Secret of Mana people went ahead and formed Grezzo and produced Ever Oasis, right? And it's now that studio is now heading up a new Zelda game, right? So again, this has been happening for a long time, right? And it seems that Visions of Mana is the first ever example of Square Enix putting out a PlayStation exclusive, expecting it to do gangbusters, expecting this to like drive console sales. This was fanboy pandering. This was bringing back a highly requested IP. This was supposed to be a big thing, right? This is Square Enix putting out a new entry in one of their IPs on PlayStation hardware, and people rejected it. Right, I've seen player essence try to dance around the issue. Right, I've seen like fanboys try and downplay what this means, but like the real reason why Visions of Mana bombed was because it was not on Nintendo Switch. It wasn't because they shut down the studio. It wasn't because of how they marketed it or the length of time they spent like in development or like the gap between releases or like the release timing or anything like that. Like the problem is that nobody wants to play on PlayStation anymore. And so when it comes to games like this, people are just going to wait for the Switch version. And that was all I heard from the developers, like going up to release. Like, when's the Switch version coming out? The Switch can't run it. Oh, we're not looking at a Switch release. Why? Again, when you're being asked one specific thing over and over and over again, where is the Nintendo version? You should probably consider putting out the Nintendo version. Like, I don't understand what's so complicated about this. I believe Vision of Mana was, like, available on PC as well. Is that correct? Like, I don't know what else it was available on. I think it was, like, PS5 and PS4 or something like that. Like, for sure. But, like, yeah, people are, like, trying to say, like, well, it didn't get an Xbox release either. Of course it didn't. Because nobody plays on Xbox. You know, like, you can look at just how many, like, RPGs, what the RPG audience is like on Xbox. Nobody plays these games on that platform. Like, again, when it comes to these Japanese developers, you would expect them to primarily be supporting the Japanese hardware. You know, Nintendo and Sony, not Sony and Xbox. You know, the platform that has literally never been viable, right? Why exactly are they so adamant that, like, oh, PlayStation and Xbox get everything, but the Switch, the Nintendo, it's pathetic. It is absolutely appalling to see how the developers refuse to do the simplest thing and produce a video game on the most popular platform. Like, what exactly is so difficult about putting something like Visions of Mana on Nintendo Switch? And I do think this is like a major, major thing. Way bigger than most people are expecting. Most people realize, because back in the past, people used to go out and buy PlayStations for games like this. You know, when all the RPG developers jumped from Super Nintendo to PlayStation, like, oh, all these RPG fans, they had to jump to PlayStation. Like, oh, man, Suikoden, like, the new Mana games, you know, Chrono Cross, you know, Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9. Oh, this stuff is amazing. Parasite Eve, right? Like, oh, man, it's a golden age for RPG fans. And to a certain extent, that was true. But, like, why were these games never released on Nintendo hardware? Like, a lot of them have still never seen an official Nintendo release. And considering just how gung-ho Square Enix is on, like, re-releasing their things all the time, it's just really odd how every single time they only seem to announce Nintendo versions of games when they're very financially desperate, right? I've brought this up a couple of times on Twitter, but I really need to reiterate this here. What happened... Nintendo and Squaresoft cut ties after the Final Fantasy VII debacle, right? You know, Squaresoft made the erroneous decision to not develop for Nintendo 64, the superior platform, and develop for the inferior PlayStation instead. And that decision cost them dearly, right? Although, like, the Final Fantasy brand itself became mainstream and popular, the company was run to the ground in a matter of years, to the point where they went bankrupt due to the failure of a movie, and they had to merge with their rival Enix. And they were struggling financially even after the merger. And so they had to come crawling back to Nintendo. Please let us release old Final Fantasy games on Game Boy Advance. And so we got like a bunch of ports of Final Fantasy on Game Boy Advance. That's how I, discovered the series, right? I grew up seeing people like with copies of Final Fantasy 1 and 2 and 5 and 6. I own 6 myself, right? Like, I really, really enjoyed those games. But the reality of it is that those ports only came about because Square Enix was desperately trying to like stabilize themselves after a very rocky, after several poor business decisions. And immediately after that, after things stabilized, after the big like console boom in the mid 2000s, like they started like doing the same thing they always did, right? They never developed any Nintendo exclusive Final Fantasies, not mainlines anyway, and focused all of their efforts on PlayStation, right? They produced new Final Fantasy VII material. They produced Final Fantasies 11, 12, 13, 14, right? Until 13 came out, like the games were all PlayStation exclusive, right? And they only made 13 on Xbox because of their financial difficulties, right? Like, again, they did everything in their power to avoid Nintendo consoles. And what's happening now? They are reaping the rewards for that, right? Nintendo consoles have become the place for Japanese RPGs. I play things like old Final Fantasy games on there. I'm playing Atelier Ryza. I'm playing like Dragon Quest 3 here soon. I'm gonna play the remake of Romancing Saga 2, all on my Nintendo Switch. And I'm not gonna play Mana. I'm not gonna buy a PS5 for like a Mana game that's probably not all that good anyway. That easily could have run on Nintendo Switch, right? I would prefer them to just release the game on my preferred platform. And they wouldn't do it, right? They lost so much money by making that decision, like making that call. And now it's too late, right? Going into next year, we're going to be bombarded with great new games from Nintendo Switch, right? Like, again, this year alone, we have a Dragon Quest game coming out. Like, they're not going to be able to compete with that. Well, compete with themselves, but like, it's like, what were they thinking? Again, did they really think this was going to work? That this was going to be some major system seller for PlayStation, right? Did they really think this would hurt Nintendo in any way? Like, again, they can't be this stupid. Like, they really thought that this would be the big thing that kept them relevant for the foreseeable future. They really thought that this was going to be a big deal. This would be a blow against Nintendo, right? Again, for the past year or so, we've been seeing this huge, like, dirge of just, like, highly overrated games on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X to try and convince people, to try and trick them into thinking these consoles are superior to Nintendo Switch. And it just isn't true. Right? Like, it's going to be really interesting seeing people, like, try to hype up things like Metaphor, Ray Fantasio, and Space Marine 2, and Astrobot, and, like, seeing them all, like, just fall flat on their faces, right? That is what we're seeing now, is that, like, gaming journos are doing everything in their power to hype up these mediocre third-party games while downplaying Nintendo ones. And this is a game that, this is yet another example of something that was put out there in an attempt to destroy Nintendo, only to fail. Right? This is only the next entry in a long line of titles that have done this. Right? We're gonna see something similar happen to like Monster Hunter Wilds and everything else that's coming out. Like, again, it's going to be really interesting to see these corporos just completely just collapse among themselves, like trying desperately to keep their PlayStation idol afloat. Because the instant that PlayStation goes down, Xbox and PC will go with it, right? Again, these corporations cannot produce the AAA games with licensed characters that they want to without PlayStation propping them up, right? You know, like just look at how expensive the licensing fees for Spider-Man were. Just look at how Larian couldn't keep working with Baldur's Gate 3 because of how Wizards of the Coast handled uh, the Dungeons and Dragons thing, right? Just look at how all of these games are bombing over and over again. It needs to be understood that Visions of Mana is not an isolated failure, right? Every game is suffering, struggling, failing to turn a profit because it's not being released on Nintendo platforms, right? If you don't develop for Nintendo, you might as well stay home and not produce anything at all because nobody is interested in your slop.